Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 27, and today I'm here with Peter Gray talking about play. Peter is a research professor of psychology at Boston College and the founding board member and president of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education. You know him from his Psychology Today blog, Freedom to Learn, and his incredible book, Free to Learn, which you've heard me recommend many times. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. If you are enjoying the Sage Family Podcast, then please scroll down and click those stars in your podcast app or on iTunes. This is a quick and easy way to support the show using the currency of feedback. Psalms 27 Girl writes, "Love how this podcast will open your heart and mind to new paradigms and perspectives, all while nurturing connection with what matters. Thank you as a first-time mom. This has brought life to my soul." Thank you so much for the reviews, Psalms 27 Girl, and you all should hop on and write a review too to help keep this show going. Adventures for this week include 2 museums and a water park. Homeschool Day at the Pacific Science Center made for a great hack school adventure. We watched a 3D turtle documentary, explored all the hands-on science-y things, and my personal favorite was the planetarium. I learned so much. After which Wes shared a quality conversation with Dr. Sean. Then we went to the Great Wolf Lodge, which is like a giant indoor water park inside of a hotel. This was Wes' birthday gift. He got an experience, and his bestie came along, so it was next level fun. This new season of motherhood really struck me. All 3 of my kids spent the whole trip flying down the biggest slides over and over again. No babies in arms, no toddlers in the kiddie pool, no littles on the kid slides. No catching, no encouraging, no comforting. Now it's all running up the stairs, hands in the air, and high fives. Sky had 2 friends meet her there and spent the whole trip adventuring independently. We would cross paths and I would get an excited, laughter-filled update as they ran off again. I didn't sit her down to feed her meals, and yet she ate. I didn't put her to bed, and yet she slept. At one point, an employee asked my friend if this pack of teens belonged to her, and then proceeded to report how lovely they all were. Independent and socialized, we're bucking all the homeschool stereotypes over here. I loved the first season of motherhood. I love this season too. Hack School's next event was a day at the Museum of Flight. We spent like 5 hours running around with our friends having fun among the aeronautic history. I share an anecdote from our day here during this episode when talking about society not supporting children's freedom and independence, so keep an ear out for that. And if you want to see photos and videos of any of these adventures, then head on over to Sage Parenting on Instagram and follow along. Today, Peter Gray is joining me to share a conversation on play. When we first took the leap into homeschooling, I dove deep into reading all I could get my hands on, and Peter's book, Free to Learn, made a profound impact. He paints a thorough picture of how children learn, primarily through play, with well-researched points and global historical examples within the context of his own family's story and time at the Sudbury Democratic School. Then when I wrote the Sage Homeschooling book, I sent him a copy, and I was so honored to receive his kind and thoughtful feedback that I took to heart. So bear with me while I try to contain my excitement at sharing a conversation with one of my heroes. Now tell us your story, Peter. Who are you? What are you passionate about? And what is your relationship with this topic of play?
Aha. Well, for many years I was a professor of psychology at Boston College. I taught a wide variety of courses in the psychology department. I've retired now from teaching, but continue to do research and a lot of writing and speaking. Um, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, which means that I'm interested in human nature and how that human nature came about by natural selection. I'm especially interested in the nature of human children and most especially in how children's nature is designed by natural selection to promote their education, their curiosity, their playfulness, their willfulness, their sociability. I'm convinced, all came about through the process of natural selection, was shaped by natural selection to serve the function of education. And so I've been conducting research and writing on this topic for a long time. And my own observations and findings, as well as my analysis of others' observations and findings, has led me more recently to also be an advocate for children's play, for children's self-directed education. I am convinced, and some of the research I've delved into and written about shows me that over recent decades, we have increasingly been constricting children's freedom to play, freedom to explore, freedom to roam, and that this is having very serious negative consequences on children's psychological as well as physical development. So that, in a nutshell, is where I'm coming from.
That is a beautifully well-informed nutshell. Okay, well, as usual, I want to start by unpacking a bit. One of my favorite lines from your book talks about how we have, quote, a school-centric view of child development that distorts human nature. I could not agree more, and I'm hoping you can speak to this a little more. What have we gotten wrong?
Well, the primary thing we've gotten wrong is that we adults, we have come to believe that we adults are the determinants of our children's growth, development, learning, that somehow they are only going to learn if we teach them. Somehow their own activities, their own self-directed activities, their own play, their own questions, their own ways of socializing, that this is kind of a waste of time and that we need to have them more or less constantly under adult direction because adults know better, adults can teach them, and so on. And I call this a school-centric view because I think that it is this idea has grown gradually as the power of schools has grown, and so school has become a much bigger deal in the lives of children and in the lives of families. And, we identify children by what their grade is in school. We brag about our children based on how well they're doing in school. We are so concerned if you're middle class or above, and now almost today, no matter who you are, you're so concerned about getting your child into the right college. And so all of this way of looking at childhood is destroying childhood. Because childhood is all about freedom and play and carefree and children. And it's not just because, and I argue this, not just because this is what makes children happy, and we're making children unhappy when we deprive them of all that. But also, this is really and truly how children learn. Children learn so much more rapidly and so much more effectively, and they learn the most important lessons of life when they're engaged in their own self-initiated activities. And we are just giving them less and less time and opportunity to do that. We're putting children into schools earlier and earlier. We used to call them daycare centers. Now we call them, preschools is supposed to be teaching, right? Kindergarten used to be a garden for children. You went there to play. Now it's like what first grade was at one point, or maybe even more so. It's
Yeah,
all
now
about
they're handing
preparing
out
them.
kits to parents of toddlers for
They're
school readiness.
That's right. Kids. Oh God. I mean, this is just atrocious. And there's
Yeah.
zero evidence that any of this is effective in the long run. Zero evidence. In fact, I've written a couple of blog posts summarizing research that suggests that it backfires. That when we put children into academic training early on, preschool or kindergarten, it has a tiny little bit of effect of increasing reading and the math, arithmetic skills in first grade. But by third grade, it's always washed out. And often by third or fourth grade, we now see a reversal, that those who were getting that kind of training are now doing worse,
Yeah.
even academically, let alone socially and emotionally, but worse even academically than those who didn't get that training. That might seem surprising to many people, but to me it's not so surprising, because I think when we train children kind of through the methods that we use, what happens is they learn it in a kind of artificial way that is not, they haven't really absorbed it intellectually.
Mm-hmm.
They've learned the skills in a certain kind of way in which they've been taught. And then that interferes later on with the actual intellectual understanding of what they're doing. I'm fairly convinced that that's the mechanism for this reverse effect. But whatever it is, it's very interesting. Our policymakers who make these kinds of decisions about early academic training, they are completely ignoring the research that shows that this is not only ineffective, but probably harmful.
Yes. Wow. Every word you just said was so profound. And I really hope that all of the people casually listening have perked up their ears and put down whatever they were doing, because all of that is so, so true. And as a parent with 3 children, once your eyes are open to this and you're made aware of it, you can see it play out in your kids. I mean, when you try to force them to stop their play and come and sit down and do this lesson in the book, you can see that it's sort of at best retained in their short-term memory, and they can regurgitate it in like a plug and chug fashion. But then as soon as they are set free again and running around playing, it's like fireworks in their brain and with all of the other people they're interacting with. And there are so many like deep lessons learned that come up over and over again as you move forward. They might discover something in the grass, and then 6 months later they're bringing it up again.
Right, exactly. The thing is when we allow children to learn in their own natural ways, we can't predict exactly what they're going to learn. We're not controlling exactly what they're going. We can't predict when they'll learn to read. We can't predict when they'll learn certain things. One thing that my research has absolutely convinced me is everybody in our culture, as long as they are in a literate environment, an environment where people read, are going to learn how to read at some point, and they will learn very quickly when they're ready to do so. And as long as they're in a numerate environment where people are using numbers and they're playing games that involve numbers and they're cooking and cutting recipes in half and so on, you can't help but learn the kind of math that you need in real life. And we just don't need to worry about those things. As long as we're raising our children in an environment where these things are part of the world, the real world in which they're interacting. And when they learn it that way, they're really learning it. So you learn. Let's just to take a simple example. You learn, maybe you're 4 or 5, maybe you're 5 years old, 6 years old, and you just really want to help your mom cooking. And so she shows you how to, you want to make brownies or whatever it is, and then you see the recipe, and the recipe is maybe for twice what you want to make. And so you explain to your child, well, we need to cut this recipe in half. And so we need to cut all these numbers in half.
Yeah.
And the child can understand that. And now the child knows what half means, knows what it means to divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2. It's a real thing. It's not just something you've memorized to pass a stupid test, right?
Yep.
And when children are learning that way, then, later on, if they want to encounter it more formally, it comes very quickly.
Yeah, it's like they have this natural foundation with real world context and meaning that makes it really easy to build upon at any point in the future when they want to dive deeper.
Exactly.
Okay, now that we've broken down what you thought you knew about play, let's start building you back up by defining what play is. What are its qualities?
Yeah, so I have developed, and not out of the blue, but based on my reading of other play scholars and my own observations, and even partly based on a study of how kindergartners define play, a definition of play. And bear with me a bit. It's not the simplest definition. My definition of play is that play is activity that has the following 5 characteristics. So to the degree that an activity has these characteristics, to that degree, it's fully play. To the degree that it has some of these characteristics or they're not fully present, it's playful to that degree. So, but an activity that is fully play. And generally, full play occurs much more often in children than in adults, rightly so, because play is really how children are designed to experience the world and to learn about the world. So here are the 5 characteristics, if I can remember them. I don't have them right in front of me, but I've said them enough, I ought to be able to remember them. Okay, the first characteristic is that it's freely chosen and self-directed. You could say in a way that's 2 characteristics, but they're so closely related.
Yeah.
It's freely chosen and self-directed. So if a teacher stands up in front of the room and says, now children, we're all going to play this, right off it's not play because it wasn't chosen by the children. I'm not necessarily against the teacher doing that.
Right.
But that's not play. Maybe it's a more playful way of doing a certain lesson, but play is something that children choose for themselves. And in fact, one of the greatest lessons of play, one of the things that children are practicing in play is how to run their own lives, how to choose their own activities. So, and then self-directed. And so you not only choose to play a certain thing, but you choose how you're going to play it. You make the rules, or you adopt, if they're already chosen rules, you have decided I'm going to adopt those rules. I'm going to abide by those rules. But if along the way that makes sense to change them, you'll change them. It's self-directed. There's no coach there. There's no adult there telling you what to do. You are running the show yourself.
There's a powerful element of agency to play.
There's a powerful element. So play is how children learn to choose activities, and it's how they learn to direct their own activities, how they learn to think ahead and to make something happen that they've decided they want to happen. If somebody else is telling them exactly step by step what to do, then that destroys their ability to learn that. Now, let me add another component to this. I've said that self-chosen and self-directed, but that's not entirely true because children, more than anything else, want to play with other children. So all by yourself, if you're just playing solo, it's totally self. But when I say self-directed and self-chosen, I mean self-directed and self-chosen by the group of children doing it. So that means they've got to put their heads together, right? The typical, you can probably remember, I certainly remember, and probably most people who are old enough to recall when children just went out and played, no adult around, what happens when you start to play? So I want to play this. And now you say, I don't want to play that. I want to play this other thing. And, I don't want to play what you want to play. But what about this? Maybe we would both want to play this. And so by this back and forth discussion, we're negotiating, back and forth discussion, we arrive at something we both want to do. What an important skill. Wouldn't it be nice if our congressman could do that? Right?
Yes.
What an important skill. Negotiation, figuring out, compromising. So we've chosen together what we want to play. Now, suppose we start to play. Suppose we're little kids and we're going to play a game of house. And I'm going to be the daddy, and I want you to be the pet dog, right? And you say, oh, gosh, you always make me the pet dog. I don't want to be the pet dog. I want to be the mommy, or I want to be the princess, or I want to be this or that. And so then we have to have a discussion about that, because here's the key to why children learn so much in play about negotiation and getting along with other people. What I know, even if I'm 4 years old, and what you know, even if you're 4 years old, is that the other person is free to quit.
Yes.
So play is freely chosen, it's self-directed, and as part of saying it's freely chosen, you're also always free to quit. So if you are unhappy, if I know, even at 4 years old, I know that if you're unhappy, you're going to quit. I might not know it fully, but if I don't know it fully and playing enough, I will learn it.
Yes.
Because you will quit. You'll say, oh, I hear my mom calling. It's time to go home now. And I have learned a certain lesson. Look, I can't always have my way. I've got to compromise. So the fact that it's self-chosen and self-directed, and that it's usually social if children have their way. And our culture is relatively unique in that children are often in situations where there are no other children around.
Yeah.
And that's a really, really sad situation for children. And that's a problem we've got to resolve. But throughout most of time and throughout most of the world, children were always in an environment where they were surrounded by lots of other children to play with. And so if one playmate doesn't work out, you play with somebody else. So that's the first of the 5 characteristics. The second characteristic is that you are doing it for its own sake. You're not doing it in order to get some reward that's outside of the play itself.
Like process over product.
So process over product, that's a good way to put it. Or as some others would put it, means over end. It's the means, it's the activity itself rather than the end of the activity. So when we engage in sort of goal-directed activities, our purpose is to accomplish something. Our purpose is to win the prize, or to escape from the tiger, or to get an A in a course, or whatever it is.
Complete the thing.
Complete the thing. And when we're doing that, we usually want to take the shortest, easiest route towards getting what it is that we're trying to get, right? Mm-hmm. And so the only purpose of the means is to get to the ends. And so you use the most direct means possible to the ends. And if you can shortcut the route to it, you shortcut the route. Play is the opposite of that. Play is all about the means. Play is the doing. The joy is in the doing, not in the end product. So just to illustrate that, imagine a child or children on a beach making a sandcastle. So you could say they have a goal, which is to make the sandcastle. But they know that sandcastle is just going to be washed into the sea at the end of the day, or the next high tide, right? Mm-hmm. So their goal is not to own a sandcastle or to have a sandcastle. Their goal is not even to see a beautiful sandcastle for a little bit of time. If an adult came along and say, okay, kids, you can stop all this hard work. I'll build the sandcastle for you. They would not be happy by that, right? Yeah. So it is clearly the building of a sandcastle. They want to build a beautiful sandcastle. So it's goal-directed, but it is the building of the thing. It's the creation of the thing, not the having of the thing.
Yes.
So that runs through all kinds of play. All of play. Play may or may not have specific goals, but whether or not it has a specific goal, the real joy is in the doing, not in the goal. So if you're doing something primarily for a trophy, or to win a tournament, or to get praise from your parents, or to get an A in school, or a gold star, then to that degree, it's not play. You're just doing it because it's fun, because you enjoy doing. And I should say, not fun necessarily always in the sense that that means you're going to always be smiling and laughing and it's never hard. You watch the kids building a sandcastle or doing anything else, and they may look very, very serious, and some of it is hard, right? And so it's not just lighthearted joy all the time, but it is self-chosen. It is what they want to do. I would say, rather than say play is doing what is fun for you to do, play is doing what you really and truly want to do at that point, just for the sake of doing it. And maybe because it's challenging you, maybe precisely because it's hard. And in fact, in many cases, I've argued that the things that children play at are precisely the things that are at the cutting edge of their ability. They're always at the cutting edge of their ability, because otherwise it's boring, right? It's boring. That's why kids quickly move beyond tic-tac-toe, because it pretty quickly gets boring. You can't improve anymore on it. But it's harder to get tired of chess or of many of the computer games, which are so complex these days, and you can go to higher and higher levels. No wonder they're attractive to people, because they're how difficult they are and how much you're learning in the process of doing them. So that's the second. And part also what is happening as a result of that quality of play. Children are learning, are discovering their passions. You know how it is that graduation speakers are always saying, follow your passions. Well, if all you've done in school, how do you have an idea what your passions are? You've never been allowed to discover your passions. Children discover their passions in play. They play at a lot of different things. And some of the things they play at, they get really, really interested. They really want to pursue it. And that's what we call a passion. The lucky people that I've studied, some of the people who I've studied who've grown up with lots of opportunity to play and explore on their own, have developed passions as children that then they pursue as careers in adulthood. And how lucky they are, because they go through all of life earning their living at the very activity that they find most rewarding to themselves to engage, right? So now the third characteristic of play, which is going to sound paradoxical to some listeners, is that play is always guided by rules. There's no such thing as unstructured play. People talk about unstructured play. But if by unstructured you mean random, you mean just random activity, that's really the literal meaning of unstructured. Random activity is not play. Play always has structure. And that structure is always determined by the players. If it's determined by somebody who's not playing, like a coach or an umpire, then it's not play. It may have some degree of playfulness to it, but it's not play. Play is activity that has structure, and it's structured by the children. So when I say that all play has rules, what I mean is these are the mental rules that the child has in mind that structure the activity that he or she is engaged in. So those children building a sandcastle, they have a certain, they've got kind of a set of rules. They may not state them, but this thing has to be made of sand. We could maybe add some sticks. It has to look like a castle. It has to be beautiful. We have to coordinate how we're doing. And as they're talking about it, they may kind of modify the rules. Okay, we're going to have a moat, and this has to be a moat around it, and we're going to fill the moat with water. And they're creating the structure, and they're creating the rules as they go. In an activity like baseball, if it's a playful game of baseball, as opposed to something like a Little League game of baseball, which is not play, but they're just getting together to make up their own game, they are saying, okay, we're going to play baseball. And everybody knows that there's certain kinds of rules of baseball, but you can never follow those rules exactly if you're just making up your game. You don't have 18 players. You don't have a laid out baseball diamond. You've got to create the rules, and you sort of negotiate the rules and create the rules that you're going to follow, and then you remind one another about what those rules are.
My youngest really enjoys wrestling with his friends, and I can absolutely see that concept play out because they all sort of understand what the rules are in order for the wrestling to stay safe and enjoyable for everyone. So if one person, say, punches or pinches, like the game instantly stops and everyone like reminds that person what their mores and customs are for their wrestling play.
And that's an excellent example. That what in fact I sometimes point out that the difference between a play fight and a real fight is the play fight has rules and the real fight doesn't. The real fight, you're doing anything you can to subdue or drive away or dominate the other person. And the goal is to end it and to subordinate the other person. In the play fight, the goal is the opposite of that. The goal is to prolong it, to have fun. And if you really hurt the other person, that will end it.
Game's over. Yeah.
So it's very interesting situation. It's interesting that boys, but also the males of other mammals do a lot of this, more so than girls or females of there are some exceptions in other mammals, but generally this is more often a male thing. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting to me that I kind of think that play fighting is the way that boys in particular learn how to be in close contact with one another, almost in the going through the motions of fighting, but not hurting the other person. Mm-hmm. It's almost how boys learn how, we can be close and we don't have to try to dominate the other person, right?
Yes.
And so in a play fight, if one is bigger or stronger, one of the unstated rules is you, the bigger or stronger, have to self-handicap.
Absolutely.
You can't use your full strength, right? The little one maybe can use his full strength. He can pound and slam and everything because he can't really hurt you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But and then there's always rules against certain things, unstated rules. No biting, no scratching, no kicking,
And sometimes it can be so subtle. I mean, I'll notice that, like, if my middle child has been on top while they're wrestling so much that the younger one resists less, then the older one will feign an injury, and then the littler one, will get back on top. So it's incredible to watch.
It is incredible to watch. And if you watch other mammals play fighting, you see a lot of the same thing. You see self-handicapping. You see also in wrestling among other mammals that have been studied, and I think this is true for boys, for humans too, is that in some sense the preferred position is to be in the subordinate position, to be the one who's underneath and you're struggling to get out, right? And so it's interesting that this is sort of behavior that has evolved to kind of learn how to deal with emergency situations in a safe situation where you've got these rules, you're not really going to hurt the other person. So there's a lot of research and ideas about play fighting. But the larger point I wanted to make here is that, so what are children? So, there's so many things children learn when they're playing. So we've already talked about some of them, but here's another one. They're learning how to follow rules. They're learning how to inhibit their spontaneous behavior. We think of play as spontaneous. In one sense, it kind of is. It's freely chosen. It's free, in that sense, but it's not necessarily spontaneously chosen. It's chosen after a lot of discussion and thought often. But once you're playing, you're freely choosing to play, but interestingly, you're putting yourself willfully in a situation where you're no longer free. You are now in a situation where you are bound by certain rules. There's certain things you can do and certain things you can't do. And so you are learning how to restrain your impulses. You're learning how to follow rules. You're also learning how to create rules. You're learning what rules are for as you kind of negotiate the rules as you go along. So somebody in this, as the boys are play fighting, somebody accidentally hurts the other one in some way, maybe by pushing them against, if it's in the house, against a certain piece of furniture. And so now suddenly a new rule arises. Mm-hmm. We have to play on this other side of the house where there's no hard furniture. It could be anything like that. You're playing a ball game in a vacant lot, and somebody keeps hitting it out into the street, and it's a big pain in the neck to go out into the street to have to fetch the ball. It's a busy street. So you make a rule. Any ball hit in that direction is an automatic out. So what children are learning when they're doing this is they're really learning the essence of democracy. They're learning why we have rules, that we have to make rules that we all agree on, and the purpose of rules is to make life more fair and more fun, right? And that's exactly what the purpose of rules are as children are playing, how to make this rule so we are all having fun. So that's the third characteristic of play. The fourth characteristic of play is that play always involves at least some element of imagination. There's some sense of fantasy about play. Children always have a sense that they are stepping out of the real world into a pretend world. And it's interesting that even very, very young children can distinguish between the real and the pretend. This is the pretend world. We're now pretending that we're monsters. We're pretending that there's a troll under the bridge. We're pretending that you're the pet dog. We don't, as we're playing, we don't say that we're pretending because that would spoil it. But after the play is over, if somebody asks, they could say, "Oh yeah, of course, we were just pretending. I didn't really think I was a pet dog, or I didn't really think I was Superman, and I'm not actually going to jump off of high buildings or try to stop a railroad train. Don't worry about that, right?" But during the play, you are Superman, or you are the dog. You are at that part. You've put yourself into a fantasy world. And what that means is that in play, children are thinking hypothetically all the time. If this is true, then what follows from that? If there's a troll under the bridge, what does that mean about how we have to behave as we cross the bridge? If I'm the pet dog, what does that mean? How do I have to behave? What am I allowed to do or not do? That means that children, even 4-year-olds, when they're playing those kinds of games, are put into the situation where they're thinking hypothetically. There are some psychologists, I'm disappointed to say, who believe that children are incapable of thinking hypothetically until they reach 10 or 11-year-olds. Piaget was the big believer in that, and there's still a lot of people who believe in Piaget. But watch any children playing, and they're thinking hypothetically all the time.
Yeah.
If this were true, which it isn't true. We know it's not true in the real world, but if this were true, what follows from that? And hypothetical thinking, as any philosopher will say, is the highest level of human thinking. This is something that presumably animals don't do, that this is human thought. This is, we are the creature that can think of things that aren't actually present, that we never actually really experienced. And that's why we can invent things. That's why we can plan for the future. That's why we can imagine what tomorrow will be like and prepare for tomorrow, even though we never experienced tomorrow yet. Right. We're capable of thinking hypothetically, and children are practicing that all the time. And think of all these. These are such extraordinarily important, basic things for children to learn, and none of these things can be taught. None of them can be taught in school. None of them are learned by lecturing or hearing a verbal report on how you do it or reading about how to do it.
Right.
They only can be learned in practice. And for children, the practice is primarily play. Their children are designed to practice life through play. Play is sort of this simulation world in which they try out various abilities and various things, and are therefore, they're not consciously doing it for this reason. They're consciously doing it because it's fun. But the result of it is they're preparing themselves for responsible life in the real world. So that's the fourth characteristic. The fifth characteristic, which kind of follows from from all the others, is that play is an activity that occurs, that involves a relaxed but attentive, or I should say a non-stressed or not highly stressed, but highly attentive frame of mind. So you have to be attentive. You have to have a very active mind in order to play, because all those other things that I said, you've got to attend to the rules, to the means of what you're doing. You've got to be able to think, you're thinking hypothetically.
Right.
You can't be passive in play. Play by definition involves an active, engaged mind. But at the same time that your mind is very active, it is not highly stressed. And the reason it's not highly stressed is precisely for the things that I've just talked about. There are no consequences to it. You're free to
Right.
fail. There's no, you're not going to let anybody down if you don't do it right. There's no trophy on the line. You're not going to get an F from some teacher. You're not going to, if it's a real play environment, you're not going to get scolded by anybody who says you're stupid, you didn't do it right. Maybe your friends will do that sometimes, but after all, they're your friends. You're taken with a grain of salt. It's not like some adult is
Right.
judging, right? And so so because of that, and because it's in the fantasy world, it doesn't count, because you're always free to quit. So if this begins to get stressful, it's really getting hard to be on your hands and knees barking as the pet dog. So, but when it reaches the point that it's really stressful to do that, then you quit. You just say, okay, I'm done being the pet dog now. Or to take another example, suppose this is motor play. Part of one of the kinds of categories of play in a way is learning skills at running and climbing and jumping and so on. So kids like to climb trees. So suppose you're climbing a tree and you've chosen to climb a tree and you're doing it for its own sake, and you maybe even have some fantasy about why you're climbing the tree and how you're going up to heaven or whatever it is that you're thinking about as you're climbing that tree. At some point you climb that tree and you begin to feel, I'm a little frightened here.
Yeah.
It's a little scary up here. And interestingly, now, I said that play always involves challenges. So part of the challenge here is how much fear can I tolerate, right? How much fear can I tolerate? Let me go a little higher. You're sort of playing with your own fear. And you are climbing higher, but then at some point you reach the point where it clicks in, oh, I'm beginning to get a little terrified, and then you come down, right? Then you come down. And kids have a very good sense of their own ability. They do get terrified at the point where they feel, I could fall here, and I'm high enough up that if I fell, this would be a serious injury. It wouldn't just be a knee or something, a scraped knee or something like that. This could be a serious injury, so you come down. So sometimes children deliberately choose to play at things that are kind of stressful for them, promote fear or even promote anger. I could give examples of that. And I think that what they're doing, they don't do it deliberately for this, but I think why natural selection created this kind of play, this kind of risky play in children, the desire to play that way, is because they're learning how to manage fear. They're learning, I can climb this, I can feel fear, and I can survive it.
Yes.
I don't fall apart when I feel fear. I can climb that tree. I felt some fear, and I came down, and that is very, very empowering. It makes you feel less afraid of life.
Yes.
Things can happen that are scary, and I can deal with them. If you're deprived of that opportunity, if you're never allowed to engage in so-called risky play, where you are actually putting yourself deliberately into situations where you feel some fear, then the first time you feel some real emergency happens in your life, you might fall apart because you've never had the opportunity to practice dealing with that feeling and to prove to yourself that you can control your mind and you control your body in the face of feeling fear. So it's interesting.
And you can troubleshoot, and even asking for help is part of that skill learning for life.
Absolutely, asking for help. In fact, when I was a kid, our parents told us, if you're out playing and something really serious happens, don't hesitate to ask a stranger, right? Now, we went through this horrible period of stranger danger, as if never talk to a stranger, right? So very opposite advice from Our
Yeah.
parents would, on the other hand, advise, and we all kind of knew, some people are kind of creepy. Stay
Right.
away from the creepy. You can usually tell, and kids quickly can learn, who's a
Yep.
safe stranger and who isn't. So it's good to arm children with certain rules for safety, but to try to protect children from any possible harm by not allowing them to have adventures, not allowing them to do anything that's a little risky, not allowing them to ever get out of our sight and our control, that is having harmful long-term consequences on children.
Yes. And I mean, in I loved that as you were sharing those qualities of play too, you were sort of weaving in the purpose of them and how we benefit from them. One of the examples from your book where you talked about the play that was happening in the concentration camps during the Holocaust really helped to like illustrate all of that for me. Can you share that example?
Yes, yeah. This is a book by a person who I think he's still a professor at the University of Massachusetts, called "Children in Play in the Holocaust." I'm not thinking right now of the author's name, but he quite some years ago interviewed Holocaust survivors who were in concentration camps as children and looked at some of the diaries. Some of them were able to write diaries, and looked at and discovered that children in this worst of all environment played. Here they are, they're starving, they're in the terrible environment and they're playing. And one of the points of his book, to some degree, adults played also, but to the degree that adults played, they played for a different reason than what children played. So he gave an example of a man who traded his crust of bread for a chessboard so that he could play chess, because by playing chess he could forget how hungry he was, right? So he was playing to escape the situation. And generally speaking, according to this author, based on his studies, the adults, to the degree they played, and they tried to the degree that they encouraged play among children, they tried to encourage play that was sort of happy play and play that would put them back at an earlier and happier time. But the children didn't play that way. They didn't want to play that way. They played at the horrors that were around them. They played games of war. They played games of daring one another to touch the electric fence. They played, and apparently in one of the concentration camps, they played crematorium. They would throw rocks as if they were human beings into a fiery pit and scream the screams of dying people. This is the kind of play that we would think we would want to protect our children from, and God knows we certainly would want to protect our children from being in an environment where it makes sense to play that way, right? But in that environment, the point that this author was making is that these children in play were playing out the realities around them, and in that way were learning to adapt to those realities, and that this was helping them survive. One of the games they played, which was called Klepsy Klepsy, which I think means stealing, and they would be, I'm forgetting exactly how it went, but there would be one person who would be blindfolded, and then all the other players would come up and hit that person. I'm sorry, then one other person would come up and hit that person. And then the blindfolded person would take his blindfold off, and he had to figure out, based on facial expressions or their responses to questions, which were basically like lie detection, right? Which child hit him. And this was apparently, whether deliberately so or just unconsciously so, this looked like practice for being able to lie to the guards about who stole the piece of bread or who, So the play was not the happy kind of play that we envision among children, but it was play that was serving a very serious purpose. And I think the larger point here is play, generally speaking, is serving a purpose. The happy play does, but also the play at at miseries. Children like to play. Children play at grotesque things. They play at murder. They play at witches. They play.
Mm-hmm.
They play. There was one author that I was reading about who was describing play at a nursery school where one of the boys was bound and was being whipped by the others. And alternatively, between whipping, the same people who were whipping him were also feeding him pretend bananas. So this was play at suffering and at caring.
Mm.
Now, as I said, play, if it's real play, you can always quit. And
Right.
this boy was voluntarily in that situation. If he wanted it to stop, all he had to say is, "Hey, that hurts."
Right.
We're not gonna. But in this description, the teacher, I guess this was probably like a nursery school. The nursery school teacher saw this and she immediately stopped it. The observer, the researcher, said that was the only true act of violence here, because it's always violent to stop play when the players don't want to stop, when none of the players want to stop.
Right.
And then the kids got really disruptive, she observed. They began to throw chairs around and act really kind of naughty, whereas when they were involved in the play, they were really immersed in it.
And I bet the teacher's going to walk away with the conclusion that, see, that kind of play led to them being disruptive.
Exactly. Very, very good point. I think that's exactly right. But the observers, the researchers who was kind of observing in this, her conclusion was that it was because it was disruptive that the kids were just mad.
Yeah.
And they didn't know what to do now. So they did
Yeah.
that, right? Yeah.
Oh man. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about mixed stage play. I run a homeschool adventure club called Hack School, and one of my favorite things to observe on our weekly adventures are the amazing dynamics of mixed stage play. So talk with us about why mixed stage play is so valuable.
Yes. Well, first of all, let me point out that until relatively recent times, recent in terms of human history, essentially all play was mixed stage.
Yeah, it didn't have a name. It was just play.
That was just play. I mean, we only started segregating children by age when we started having age-graded schools. So then we segregated children by age because of the way we do our schooling. We think of it as kind of an assembly line, and certain things added on to you as you go through this assembly line. And so it made sense from that point of view to segregate children by age. But the result of segregating children by age is that the kids that then you are most often in contact are all your same age. They're kids who are within a year of your own age. And sort of you develop the attitude, society as a whole develops the attitude that kids' friends are always the same age as them. And so then even outside of school, and this is part of what I call as we talked about earlier, sort of this schoolish mentality of all of society, we began even in things outside of school. So we have age-segregated sports outside of school. We have age-graded activities of all sorts. And the result of that is that children, for the first time in history, in modern times, many children have almost no opportunity to interact with children who are significantly older or younger than themselves. Yeah. And the sad thing about that is that a lot of my own research has been on age-mixed play, and I'm convinced that age-mixed play is more valuable, all in all, than same-age play for a number of reasons. One reason is that the younger children in such play are always learning from the older children, not because the older children are deliberately teaching them, although sometimes that occurs too, but more often just because in order to play together, and the older children and younger children do want to play together. I've observed that. Even when there's enough kids your own age, kids like to play with kids who are younger and older than themselves. They are attracted to one another when they're free to do so. So when you're playing together, if you are older and more competent, it's not always the case that you're more competent because you're older, but on average, the older kid, the bigger kid is better at whatever it is you're playing at. that older child, in order to play with the younger child, has to boost the younger child up to his or her level in some way. And that boosting occurs very naturally. It's not necessarily consciously thought out. And this boosting is referred to by researchers as scaffolding. So the older, more competent one is scaffolding the behavior of the younger one, which allows the younger one to engage in activities that are more complex, more sophisticated than the younger one would ever be able to do just with other kids his or her own age. So, there's a lot of examples I could give. One example that I often give because it's so simple and easy to visualize is, imagine if you had a preschool or kindergarten that just had 4-year-olds, only 4-year-olds, and you had lots of opportunity to play. They could only play at 4-year-old things, right? And so there'd be a whole realm of activities that they just simply would have zero opportunity to learn anything about, or very little opportunity. So let's say a simple game of catch, just tossing a ball back and forth and catching it. 4-year-olds, for the most part, can't do that, the typical 4-year-old. They can't toss the ball straight enough for another 4-year-old to catch it, and they can't catch well enough to catch the wild throw of another 4-year-old. So they might start, let's have a game of catch. Maybe they've seen other people play catch and they want to play catch, but it just would quickly fall apart. It's no fun. Neither of them can throw or catch the ball well enough. But now put an 8-year-old in the mix, right? So you've got an 8-year-old there who kind of is keen on playing with the 4-year-olds. And of course, the 4-year-olds are always attracted to an 8-year-old, right? So the 4-year-old and the 8-year-old can play a game of catch together because the 8-year-old can toss the ball gently into the hands of the 4-year-old. That's scaffolding. He's making it possible for that 4-year-old to actually catch the ball some of the time.
Yeah.
And so the 4-year-old is having fun and feeling good and gaining skill at catching. And the 8-year-old can leap and run and catch the wild throw of the 4-year-old. Now notice that what's happening is neither one is making a sacrifice here. They're both having fun. They're both stretching their skills. They're both at the limit of their ability. The 4-year-old is at the limit of his ability to catch a ball that's tossed directly into his hands and to throw a ball that at least is in the air long enough that the 8-year-old could somehow catch it, right? So.
Yes.
And the 8-year-old is certainly stretching his ability to jump and leap and catch wild throws. So they're both stretching their throwing and catching ability. In addition, what else is the 8-year-old learning? The 8-year-old is learning something even more important than that, which is how to kind of be a leader, how to care for another person, a younger person. How seeing himself as the mature person. So 8-year-olds are not very often in our world, in a society where they can see themselves as the mature person, the person who can help, the person, and this 8-year-old now can see that. And so, this is an example. This occurs in every realm, in intellectual realms, in physical realms, in emotional realms. The older children are scaffolding the younger ones into higher levels of activity. And even when they're not playing together, the younger ones are observing the older ones.
Yes.
They're seeing what the older ones do, and they want to do those things. They want to do those things. So I studied children I have in the past, not recently, but in the past studied children at Sudbury Valley School, where children of age 4 on through high school age are all mixed together. They're not segregated together, and where they learn by following their own activities. I am convinced, as is the person who was the founder of that school, Danny Greenberg, he was convinced right from the beginning, that the reason that school works is because of the age mixing.
Yeah.
So the children who are the younger children who, let's say, can't read. Let's just take reading as an example because so many people think it's important to learn how to read. So let's take reading. So you've got 4 and 5-year-olds there who maybe can't read, but then you've got 7, 8, 9-year-olds who read and are enjoying reading. So those little kids, they're observing they're observing kids who are not much older than them. They can identify with these kids. It's not like adults who are in a whole different world,
Right.
right? These are people that I'm almost like that. They're only a little bigger than me and so on and so forth. And my gosh, they're having such fun. Maybe they're reading comic books or whatever it is they're reading, or they're reading the words of a computer game, and they're playing this computer game that you can only play if you can read.
Mm-hmm.
And they're and that what is sort of going through these younger kids' mind is, I want to join that club. I want to be able to read just like they can read. So the motivation to read arises. Once you're motivated to read, it's actually not very hard to learn how to read.
Mm-hmm.
Also learning to read in the way that I just described, by being scaffolded. So let's go back again to the computer game example. You've got kids. One of the things that happens at that school is kids play computer games socially. So there's a bunch of kids on the computer and they're playing it together. They may be on the same computer or parallel computers, but they're in the same room playing the same game. And so you're playing a game that involves some ability to read what's on the screen. And in order to play the game, you've got to know what's being said. So the kids who can read are reading it to the kids who can't. But in the process of doing that, they are inadvertently teaching reading.
Mm-hmm.
They're pointing out, see that word? That's this. That word is going to occur a lot, and that's what this means, right?
Yes.
I've even in some of these contexts heard it merge into almost like a reading lesson. There's a code here. Sound it out.
Mm-hmm.
And they're teaching. So it's the age mixing that allows you. If you just had kids all the same age, they started off at 4 and they went on and on and on. They might not learn to read because there would be nobody in their environment that they can identify with who's reading. I mean, maybe they would learn at home. I actually believe they would learn at home. I think you can't help but learn to read if you're in a literate environment. But the real inducement for reading that I see, why children learn to read earlier than why they otherwise might, is because reading is an activity that they see older children doing. Mm-hmm. But they also see older children climbing trees. They see older children doing all kinds of things that are a little bit beyond their own ability or stretching the ability of the younger kid, and they want to do it. So the older kids are stretching the younger kids up all the time.
And like you said, it's mutually beneficial. I mean, even in that reading example, like older kids will often read to the younger kids, which improves their reading skills as well, in addition to all those social pieces like the empathy and the leadership. And so it's just mutually beneficial across the board. And when you see kids in these mixed age groups, it feels so natural, even and especially because that's how it is for us adults. Like, I get tremendous benefit out of having friends in a variety of different ages and different benefits in different directions. And you see when there's like a chunk of kids that are all the same age, they get stuck very quickly, and they will often, one of them will say, well, who can help us? Who should we invite to join us? Someone in a different age bracket. If it's older kids, they might want some younger kids to play some role that none of them want to play. Or if it's they're reaching for an older kid, it's because they're not sure how to move through something that they're stuck on.
Exactly. Yeah. Sometimes people worry about bullying. They think the older kids are going to bully the younger kids. And as far as I can see, in fact, the research shows that older kids are actually nicer in the presence of younger kids than they otherwise are, and that they are much more likely to be protecting the younger kids from bullying rather than actually bullying. There's no fun in bullying a younger kid. I think sometimes in the school environment where there's a sort of status issues and there's a kind of distorted socialization that goes on, you see some of that. But at Sudbury Valley, you just don't see that. What you do see is that you see older kids breaking up fights among younger kids. Yep. You see them helping to solve problems. You see older kids who are much, here's an example. I was once observing there, and there was a new student there who was kind of shy, and she sort of screwed up her courage, and she went over to a couple of girls who were about her age, and she asked if she could join them in the game that they were playing. And in a somewhat rude way, these girls said no to her. They said, no, you can't play with us. And and this little girl kind of walked away looking very sad. So these girls were maybe 7 or 8 years old, but there was a somewhat older girl, maybe 10, maybe 11, who saw this. And now there's no rule, there's nothing wrong. You don't have to invite anybody into play. That would be wrong. Everybody has the right. But this girl who was 10 or 11 could see that it was kind of rude the way those other girls treated this new girl. And they could see that this little girl was hurt by this. She's trying to find her way as a new student in this school. It's a little scary. So she went over to the two girls and she said, how would you like it if you were in that situation, if you were new, and so on? Well, then shortly after that, the girls invited that other play. I was so touched. And even now, as I describe it, I'm touched by it. And that was so much more powerful than if an adult had come over to do that.
Absolutely.
Right? Because this was somebody who was just an age mate. It's somebody who didn't have any duty to do it. Mm-hmm. It's just somebody who was illustrating the kind of compassion that people should feel for one another. So that's that kind of thing, that's a somewhat dramatic example of it, but that kind of thing happens all the time.
Absolutely. It happens in, 1,000 different ways over the course of, a small amount of time when you have a mixed age group. I see it happening, and it's profound for me when I see it, just because I grew up in complete isolation from anyone who was not my exact same age.
Yeah.
Well, and that's a really good lead into the next question I had for you, because I wanted to talk about equality. And I'm going to read another one of my favorite quotes from your book. The golden rule of social play is not do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Rather, it is do unto others as they would have you do unto them. The equality of play is not the equality of sameness, but the equality that comes from granting equal validity to the unique needs and wishes of every player. And this is profound, and something I talk a lot about in coaching with families regarding parenting siblings. And it's something that has actually helped me a lot in all relationships of life. Yeah. So how can we support this level of moral development in our kids?
Yeah, I think we can support it. I think that level of moral development is one of the things that children learn in play. Mm-hmm. And maybe especially in age mixed play, right? Because you're not going to have fun playing with somebody who has different abilities than you if you expect to treat them in the same way that you want to be treated by them.
Right.
Just to take a very simple example, this is an example I think I have in my book and in some of my other writings, but let's say you're actually playing baseball, a pickup game of baseball. And I remember this. A good share of my early childhood was in a town where we went out to the vacant lot and played baseball practically every day through the summer. And it was always a different group of people there. There'd be big kids, little kids. Some people would have a glove, some didn't. You had to figure out how to share things and so on and so forth. And you'd have to make up the teams and work out the ground rules every time you played. But one of the things you very quickly learned, if you didn't already know it, is that you can't treat everybody the same in that game, right? Mm-hmm. Otherwise, they'll quit. So you've got Big Billy, who's potential big leaguer at some point. I mean, he can really wallop the ball, and he can throw so hard that nobody else would ever be able to hit it if he pitched all the time, right? Well, you're not going to have him as the pitcher, or if you do have him as the pitcher, he's going to pitch underhand and soft, especially to the little kids, right? Yeah. And even his own teammates, if he threw hard to the little kid on the other team, even his own teammates, probably through humor, would criticize him for it. Yeah. They would, because, you can't do that. The little kid will have no fun. And from a more selfish point of view, the little kid will at some point go home and we need even the little kids, or we don't have enough to play this game. Yeah. We need him to go chase the ball. So we need him, but he's going to quit if he can't ever have a chance to hit the ball when he's batting. So on the other hand, when a really good batter is up, it would be insulting to pitch softly to him. So So one of the things that happens when you're in play is children learn to be very good psychologists. They learn to
Yeah.
figure out what it is that the other person wants and needs, and how can I provide that? And I have to be able to provide that, otherwise this person will quit. And you're learning that it would be silly to think that what the other person wants is exactly what I want. That would just be silly. And that's silly in all of life. That's silly in all of life. It's silly for me to think that my wife wants me to treat her in exactly the same way I want her to treat me. That would be silly. We're different people, different needs, right? We have to understand we're equal in our relationship, but we're not the same.
Yes.
So, and children practice that all the time in life. And so as much as I hate to knock the golden rule, it's a simplistic rule.
Yes.
Children are learning something much more complex and helpful than that in play.
I think of the golden rule as like one step along that process of moral development. So like it's good if you can get to that point, but then you have to evolve beyond that point in order to have really successful, fulfilling relationships in life.
Right, exactly.
Okay, let's talk about technology. There are a lot of scary headlines in the media vilifying technology, but you describe computers as tools of modern society like bows and arrows in the past. What is the best thing parents can do who are concerned about the effects of technology on their children?
Yeah, this is probably where I get more arguments than any other question ever raised. There are lots of people who agree with me all the way down the line, but don't agree with me on technology. So
I am not one of them.
So let me present my point of view on it, but let me also acknowledge at the same time that I'm not in the business of advising individual parents about how to deal with their individual children, nor am I in the business of, nor do I believe that that what I say as a generality applies absolutely to everybody.
Disclaimer registered.
So disclaimer registered. So what I have done, I'm a researcher. So when I hear somebody make a claim, I want to know, well, what's the evidence for that claim? What's the evidence? What do we really know? How can we back that up? What do we honestly know?
Based on what is one of my favorite questions. Based on what?
What's the research that supports this? So at some point, I confess I'm not a video gamer myself. My son, who's by now approaching 50, has been a video gamer his whole life. He was on the cutting edge of it as a child, right, when we first began to have it. And so I've seen them. I'm aware of them. I read about them. I have friends who do it, and so on and so forth. But I don't play the games myself. And I didn't initially have a real opinion about it. I could see that it didn't harm my son any, and I can see other people playing a lot of video games, and I've seen them do it growing up and go on to great lives. So I certainly am not, just based on common observations, it's obvious to me that people can play a lot of video games and it's not destroying their life in some way. So, but because I was asked that at almost every talk I gave, and I wasn't talking about video games, I was talking about outdoor play and so on, and how we need more of that. Almost always the first question would be about video games and how much screen time should children be allowed, or should they be allowed any, or as if screen time is all the same thing.
Right.
So I decided well, I'm a researcher. There's supposedly been a lot of research on this. People keep saying that there's studies that show this or that. So let me look at the research. So I did an honest examination of the research. I started off by by just Googling by just Googling harmful effects of video games, and came up with a whole list of harmful effects that people are claiming. It causes obesity, it causes ADHD, it causes social isolation, it causes violence, it causes school shootings, it causes, on and on and on. And so with every claim made, I tried to see, are they citing any evidence? Are they referring to some article? What's the evidence for this? And I would pursue the evidence. and I would find the evidence was lacking. And, would based on one case study. So one school shooter happened to be a video game player, and it led to an article about the effect of the violent video games on becoming a school shooter. Well, so I went into the literature, and it turns out, believe it or not, that school shooters are less likely to play video games, including less likely to play violent video games, than just the average male who's the same age as the average school shooter. Now, I'm not about to claim that playing video games is the reason you don't become a school shooter, but there's clearly no evidence, zero evidence, that playing video games leads to school. So then about violence in general, I looked at the evidence. And there are some studies that claim that playing violent video games promotes violence, but they're all laboratory studies in which the violence, and I put quotation marks around the violence, is what I would call pretend violence in the laboratory.
Right.
And it's kind of triggered by the suggestion in the laboratory, this is what you're supposed to do. So here's a typical experiment. You have one group of subjects who come into the laboratory, they play a violent video game. Another group of subjects come into the laboratory and they do some control thing, some innocuous thing. And then you test them on supposedly your test of violence. Now, the typical test of violence is something like this. And it's presented as if this is now another little experiment we're doing. And this other person in this other room, you are in this experiment, you're supposed to punish this other person every time they get a wrong answer to something. And the way you're going to punish them is by telling the person in the other room who's controlling that other person how long they should hold that person's hand in ice water, something like that, right? So hand in ice water. Or in some of them, it's how much spice to put in the pizza you're going to give them. So this is all in the laboratory. Your mind says, look, these are researchers doing this. This can't be real dangerous, right? Otherwise, they wouldn't be doing it, right? And I've just watched this violent thing. One of the things we know about being a subject in an experiment is that subjects generally want to do what they think the experimenter wants them to do. They want to please the experimenter, help support the experimenter's hypothesis, right? Right. So I've just played this violent video game. I guess I'm supposed to do something kind of towards the violent end, right? So I suggest holding the guy's hand in ice water a little longer. I add a little more spice to the pizza or whatever it is that we're doing. To me, that's not a real measure of violence, right? That's not the same thing. That's not. Now, the only really well-done study I know that's even looking for correlation with real-world violence, with playing violent video games, was a very well-designed study involving a large number of boys and young men who all lived in a neighborhood where there actually is quite a lot of violence, and quite a number of the males in that environment do get arrested at some point for violent crimes. And so this was a study in which they looked for correlation over a large number of how much they were playing with video games, how much violent video games they were playing, and whether or not later on they were ever arrested for a violent crime. Significant number of them were. And the result was no relationship at all between whether they were playing violent video games and were arrested for violent crime. A strong relationship, no surprise, between whether there was violence in their home and what they were. So if their dad was beating their mom or beating them, they were quite likely to be arrested for violence later on. Real-world violence breeds real-world violence. There is no evidence that the pretend violence in a video game breeds real-world violence. And as far as I can tell, there never has been any such evidence. There's a long history of such research. Going back to, do violent movies, does violent television cause real-world violence? And nobody has ever been able to show even a strong correlation, let alone a cause-effect. You all might almost expect there would be a correlation. It's almost surprising there isn't a correlation because Because even if watching violent movies or playing violent video games doesn't promote violence, you might assume that people who have a violent tendency, who are involved in real world violence, would also be interested in violent movies and playing violent video games. It's almost surprising that that's not the case, right?
Yeah, they're just not.
They're not. And in fact, there's research suggesting, if anything, people who are involved in real violence play less of everything than people who are involved, who are not involved in violence. One of the best predictors of violence in adulthood is you don't play much as a kid, including you don't play cops and robbers, as we used to do. We used to shoot one another. I killed lots of cops as a kid, right? I didn't grow up to be a cop killer, right? But I knew the difference between, my cap gun shooting,
Yeah.
pretend cops, and I never would have dreamed of shooting a real cop, right? And still don't.
Thank goodness.
At least I usually don't. So the kids know the difference between. Well, that's just one example. I mean, I kind of went through the whole list, and recently there's been a lot of talk about so-called video game addiction, and people are worried that their kids will become addicted, and there are headlines about. One of the headlines I quoted in one of my blog posts was from the New York Post headline that said, "Digital heroin." Can you imagine?
Oh my gosh.
Digital heroin. That was the headline. And this person is a clinical psychologist who's apparently treated some patients who he believes are suffering from video game addiction. And again, these are case examples, 2 or 3. It might be that there are a few people who are having a problem. But his argument was that he said point blank, if your kid on Minecraft, he used Minecraft somehow as an example, which is one of the most innocuous games, I believe. Your kid's brain on Minecraft is like a brain on heroin. And how scary is that for the typical parent? No wonder parents are frightened, about their playing video games. And so I looked up the research, and indeed, there is some evidence, no surprise, to the best that we can identify based on the kinds of brain studies done, that when you play video games, certain areas of the brain get activated that are also activated by heroin or by any other recreational drugs. So these are, lo and behold, the pleasure areas of the brain.
Right.
Everything that's pleasurable.
Right. The same things that light up when you're hugging your mom or when you're eating your favorite dessert.
Exactly. We should ban hugging. We certainly should ban sex. I'll tell you that. So these are the things that anything that causes pleasure is going to light up those areas of the brain. Right? Yeah. And then there are other studies that show that suggest, it's very hard to do these studies, and they tend to get exaggerated and distorted once they get into the popular press. But there are other studies that show what can be described as long-lasting changes in the brain when you're playing video games, if you play them intensely. Now, what isn't pointed out, and what the people doing that research know very well, but they don't put into their articles or make clear to the people writing the popular articles, is anything that you do in which you're learning something changes the brain.
Right.
That's how learning occurs. That's how we build abilities. The brain is in that sense like a muscle. You exercise certain parts of it, and those parts actually physically grow. Right. They physically grow. So you can see changes in the brain. The brain restructures itself a little bit. So the assumption people hear is, oh my God, playing video games is changing my child's brain. The assumption is any change in the brain must be a damaging effect. Mm-hmm. But in fact, the research suggests that this is brain building. So it turns out that there was actually a review article that in one of my recent blog posts, I referred to this review article that reviewed all the studies that have been done on brain changes. And what is found is, no surprise, those areas of the brain that are involved in the kinds of cognitive abilities that are exercised by playing certain video games those parts of the brain grow. So parts of the brain that are involved in keeping a lot of information in your mind at once, which in this day and age is a valuable skill, right? And
Yeah.
is a valuable skill for many video games. Those parts of the brain grow, and so there you become better at keeping information. That kind of so there's a number. You become perceptually better. You actually begin to be able to see things that you couldn't see before, see details, see differences between things, because so many of the games involve quick perception, and so
Right.
those perception abilities grow. And it turns out there are cognitive studies done. What long-term cognitive effects? There are many of the same abilities that are tested by IQ tests. It's been shown that playing video games improves those abilities over a long run. This is not just a momentary, temporary effect. This is a
Right.
building that occurs over a long period of time. And lo and behold, the same brain areas that are involved in those cognitive effects are growing. So that delving into the research, I could find many more positive effects of playing video games than negative effects. I do think that there are some people who play video games to excess, and by excess, I don't mean it's just a lot. I think there are some people who play video games a lot, and it would not call it excess, because I think they're enjoying the video games and they're getting a lot out of it. And they have other options, and they're choosing the video game instead of the other options. I think there are some people who are playing video games a lot as an escape from problems. So they've got problems in their life, and the video game helps them escape. You could say that could be, in some sense, a good thing. We all want to escape from our problems. But it could also be a way of never dealing with whatever the problem is.
Right.
And so there is a correlation to some degree, more so in adults than in kids even, between depression and extreme video game. It's not that all depressed people play video games, nor it is certainly not the point that in fact, overall video game players seem to be less depressed than non-video game players. But there are some people who are highly depressed and play a lot of video games. So you look at them and you can draw what I think is the mistaken conclusion that the video game play is causing the depression. What I would say instead is the video game play is not solving the depression problem. The depression is from something else. And maybe the video game is even inhibiting them from solving it because it provides them from an escape. So they're unhappy at work, they're unhappy in their marriage, they're being bullied at school. Whatever the problem is, they haven't figured out how to confront that problem and deal with the problem. And so they're playing video games all the time. And so that's a person who needs help. You're not necessarily going to solve the problem by taking away the video game. Now the person has nothing.
Right.
So now they're just stuck with that problem and they have no way. But by helping that person figure out what the problem is, and helping that person figure out how to solve the problem, that would be really helpful. So, our knee-jerk response always, when we believe we see a problem with our kids, is to think, well, what they're doing is causing the problem, and if we can just stop them from doing that, then the problem will go away. So we see our kids are playing a lot of video games, and we see also that our kid is unhappy in some ways. We see our kid is getting angry a lot. We see our kid is having tantrums. We see our kid is not pleasant at dinner with us. And I hear from parents for whom that's true. They describe this, and they're very quick to attribute it to the video game. And I'm wondering, well, is it the video game that's doing it, or is it the fact that your child's menu of choices is already over-limited? Maybe your child is playing video games all the time, and it's not satisfying him completely, and in some ways dissatisfying, because there's nobody else to play with outside. There's no other way to play. This is the only way I can play. I think if we more often thought about, instead of our knee-jerk response is to close down the menu.
Right.
One more thing our child can't do. Already our child can't go out and play by himself. Already our child can't walk to school by himself. Already our child can't, can't go out as kids used to do and meet with other kids his age away from adults to just have conversations among themselves. Now we say you can't play video games either. And also we're going to take away your social media because we believe social media is having harmful effects and da, 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 da.
Yeah.
So we increasingly, supposedly all in good intention to protect our children, we keep taking more and more stuff away from them. Whereas my claim is we need to add stuff back in. We need to start trusting our children to make good choices, but they can only make good choices if the choices are there for them to make.
Right.
We can't, I hear it over and over again. I hear it from people my age, and I get mad at them who are saying things like, oh, this younger generation, all they want to do is play video games and be on social media. They don't want to talk to one another in real life. They never want to go outdoors. And my response to that is, I think they do want to do those things. In fact, there are studies showing that they do, but they're not allowed to do it.
Yes.
And even those who are allowed to do it, there's nobody else outdoors to play with. Nobody. It wasn't, when I was a kid, you went outdoors and there were always other kids. Beginning at age 4, you could go outdoors by yourself and there'd be other kids in the neighborhood to play with. That's no longer true. When my son was a kid, many years later, it wasn't so much that, but by the time he was 12 or 13, you could go and hang out at the mall and there would be these gangs of kids roaming the mall,
Yes.
And they would be with other, there'd be no adult there. This was their way of interacting with one another and having their time. Now you don't see that anymore, partly because parents don't allow it, but even if the parents allow it, the security guards don't allow it. So more or less ban children from public spaces, and then we blame the children for not being in public spaces, right?
Yes.
And then we want, instead of blaming ourselves for not allowing them in public spaces, we blame technology. It's the computers that are so seductive, and that has addicted them, and so now they're just on their computers and they don't want to go outdoors anymore. I just think we've got it backwards.
We absolutely have it backwards. And when I'm coaching with families, that's the same approach that I take, where we focus on fleshing out the rest of their lives and trying to meet all of their needs more fully and more wholly, and leave the screens as they are and see how things sort of settle back into a better balance. And to your point, I was just at this large museum in our community yesterday, and we were there with a big group of friends, and my 13-year-old was exploring the museum with an 8-year-old friend of hers, and they were exploring things on their own, and a security guard dragged them back over to me saying that kids are not allowed to be in the museum without a parent. And I said, I am the parent and I am in the museum. And a 13-year-old can't walk around a museum? And she said, no, she has to be right beside you. And I said, were they doing anything disruptive? She said, no, they were lovely. They were being respectful and following the rules. That's just our policy.
That's the world we're in. And that's how we are literally infantilizing children. Children beyond the age of 4 are no longer infants. They're capable of following rules. They're capable of watching out for themselves. But we are treating, even as the example you just gave, 13-year-olds as if they're infants.
Yes.
And society in general is doing that. And so even parents like you who understand that your child is capable is running into authority figures in society who are operating on an assumption that children can't be trusted.
Yes, and I love the way you talk about technology as it being a modern tool of society, like bows and arrows, because children need to play with these things, even things that their parents may not quite understand, in order to build these skills that turn out to be valuable in ways that the parents cannot necessarily foresee. For example, my husband is a senior UX designer in a game division for the biggest company in the world. And when he was younger, that job did not exist.
Didn't exist. Right. Yeah.
So the adults could have seen that video game playing and could have been saying, well, that's pointless. That's a waste of time.
Right. Exactly. No, exactly. And throughout history, whenever there's some new technology developed, the younger generation are attracted to it like flies to sugar, and the older generation are afraid of it.
Yes, that
And
is
they're
so
and they're
true.
absolutely convinced that this is going to be the ruination of the younger generation. So, when the printing press was developed and novels could be bought cheap. This was going to ruin the younger generation. It would especially destroy the morals of young women. They would read romance novels,
Oh
and
my
God
gosh.
knows what would happen then. Right? And you can find all of this when the telephone came out, and the telegraph when that came out. It was every new development. And when the younger generation began to use it, the older generation said, that's the end of humanity.
Okay, well, we were just talking about independence, and another question I get a lot from parents is around expectations for independent play. Parents wanting their kids to play more independently. So, what can parents do to support more independent play? And given our conversation that we just had, my feedback would be like freedom
Yeah,
being
yeah.
a big part of that.
Yeah, I would say the primary thing is to allow it. And I think the main thing has to be so, in the past, all play was independent, and not independent in the sense that there were not adults involved. Essentially, all play. And in fact, my definition of play is that if adults are involved, they're just players because they want to play.
Right.
They're not there to run it, any more than anybody else is. But in the past, play was always, play by definition is something that the players initiate, that they control, and so on. I think that in today's world, we're not going to, at least overnight, we're not going to in any way be able to return to the world that I grew up in the 1950s, where kids were just everywhere.
Yeah.
And you could go into any neighborhood almost at any time of day that it was not dark out and school wasn't in session, and you would find kids outdoors playing, no adults around. That we're not going to go back to that, at least not anytime soon. Parents are afraid of it. Society prevents it in various ways. I think what we have to do is create situations where there are going to be a relatively large number of children present, plenty of things to play with, and at least one adult, probably legally nowadays you have to have more than one adult, who are there and whose explicit job is to be there sort of the way a lifeguard on the beach is. You're there for
Right.
emergency. You're not there to tell them how to build a sandcastle, right?
Right.
You're not there to control the play. You're not even there to solve every little quarrel, to pick up everybody who falls, to treat every scrape and bump. You're just there for actual emergencies,
Right. If
right?
someone needs a ride to urgent care.
If someone needs a ride to urgent, you know how to call 911. You know how to you've got an adult there. If there's a really serious fight, and you have to be able to distinguish between the kind of squabbling that kids do, where they're learning by figuring out how to solve this squabbling. But you need somebody who's trained that way. In the UK, there's actually a profession called play worker, which is somebody, and there are some of these people in the United States who work at adventure playgrounds, who are actually go through training to do this, to be able to distinguish between what's really an emergency and what isn't.
That's brilliant.
And how to be present without being present. You're
Right.
there. You're there, but you're not conspicuously there.
Yeah.
So, you can easily forget that lifeguard on the beach because he's not in your face, right? So and you're playing, you're not, but the lifeguard on the beach is there to make sure that nobody drowns, and there are probably certain rules he's there to enforce, which are rules that truly have to do with safety, not rules that have to do with no teasing or no
Right.
this, no running on the beach. Right.
Right.
If we can, one of the nonprofit organizations that I'm involved in is called the Let Grow Foundation. And we are in various ways helping to bring free play back to the world. And we're working, among other ways, one way we're working is through schools. And so one of the school districts that we're involved with is the Patchogue Medford School District on Long Island in New York. And the superintendent there he recognizes a lot of these problems. He's actually doing some very pioneering things in improving the school environment in a lot of ways. But he has started, they call it Play Club. Everything in school that's not curriculum is called club. So this is Play Club. And Play Club, my ideal would be that Play Club occurs every day after school, the entire time after school from when the classes end at, say, 3 o'clock until parents are home from work. And the kids would have free age-mixed play. If it's an elementary school, K through 5 grades, all playing together, inside the school, outside the school, using the gymnasium, using the outdoor playroom, using the art supplies, using the computers, everything's open for play. And you'd have a couple of adults making sure that it's safe enough. You'd have some rule about cleaning up before you go, put everything away that, and I'm convinced it would work. And I think that would help really bring a significant amount of play. Well, although to me, that sounds like it should be easy to do. It turns out it's not easy to do. There are all kinds of bureaucratic and legal problems that have to be surmounted. This superintendent is intent on ultimately surmounting them, but he's starting off small with Play Club just one day a week in the morning before school. And I thought, oh, that'll never work. Who's going to ever get up early to go to school, even if it's for play? Well, it turns out it's working. The kids are so almost desperate for play. They're making sure that their moms get them up early and get to school early. And there was actually the NewsHour, the PBS NewsHour did a documentary on it, and I was there, and Lenore Skenazy.
I was just going to say, I think I heard Lenore Skenazy talking about that program.
And so she and I started this. She and I and a couple of other people started this. Lenore is the president of the organization, is the main mover for it. So she and I were there observing this because we helped plan it and start it. And as I said, I had some skepticism about it because partly for what I just said, I was worried that kids wouldn't get up. Secondly, I was worried for some legal reason they have to have teachers watching. I had hoped they would just hire people at a lower than teacher pay rate,
because they'd come without all the baggage and authority,
and who would come not with expectation I'm supposed to be a teacher, but they have, for some legal reason, they have to have teachers do it. And so I suggested just what I told you. I suggested that so tell the teachers that while they're doing this, they're not teachers. Don't think of yourself as a teacher. Of course, professionally, you're a teacher, but you're not teaching here, right? Your job here. And I gave them two analogies, and I'm not sure to what degree this was conveyed, but I kind of like both analogies. One was the lifeguard on a beach. The other was the analogy of being a naturalist who's observing some exotic species of animal out in the wild.
I love that.
and you're trying to learn about them.
Yes.
But to learn about them, you can't intervene. You don't go in and interfere with their quarreling. You don't go in because then you're controlling their behavior. You're trying to learn about how they behave. You're trying so watch them from the point of view. This is a curious species of animal. What can I learn about them by watching how they play together?
I sometimes tell parents to be anthropologists for a while they're deschooling.
That's a great way. That's a great analogy too. That's a great way to think about it. So I was concerned. And when I was down there, I was amazed at how beautifully it was working. The teachers truly were holding back. They truly were letting the kids play. The kids were running in the hallways. What school kids run in the hallways? They were roughhousing. They were playing. They were having such fun, and they were playing all kinds of ways. And the fact that it was age mixed, here's just to give one more example of age mixed. I asked the photographer I don't think he ended up getting it because it was a very short clip that they put on the television program. But I pointed out to him an example of it. So there was this little boy probably a kindergartner, who looked kind of lost. Everybody was having fun around them, and this little boy just was kind of standing there in the middle of the gymnasium, seeming not to know what to do. And I was kind of watching to see what would happen. And first of all, I was pleased that no teacher went over to try to suggest something to him do, because part of what you learn in play is to figure out how to solve this problem of what to do, right? So he's standing there, looking a little lost, looking a little sad, and suddenly a big girl, probably a fifth grader, and I don't think she was a sibling to him because they were different colors, She came over and started chasing him. And immediately they were both just giggling and squealing in delight, and he was so happy. Now, who knows exactly what that older girl's motivation, but I'm pretty sure that she had two motives. One, it would just be fun to chase a little kid. And two, there's a little kid who's looking a little sad. I can cheer him up, right?
Yeah.
And so it just illustrates how if we can just hold back, we adults can just hold back, kids are very, very good at solving all kinds of problems, including social problems. And they learn so much when we allow them to do that. So, but this kind of gathering would never happen naturally in today's world, where you've got, 5-year-olds on through 11-year-olds,
Right.
all playing together, 150 of them, lots of possible playmates, all kinds of things to play with. This just doesn't happen naturally in our world. So we have to create the opportunities for it to happen. So I think it can happen at schools. I think it could become a regular thing at schools. I think there's other ways of doing it. Bringing adventure playgrounds into every neighborhood. They're not very expensive to create.
I love those.
There. There's a lot of ways to, we shouldn't throw up our hands and say, oh, because this is no longer the 1950s, we've just got to deal with the fact that free play is not possible for our kids. That would be very, very sad conclusion. We've got to figure out how to bring it back to kids. And there's lots of ways that we can do it. We just have to have the will to do it.
Yes, I completely agree. So a lot of times when parents are saying, how can I support more independent play from my kids? And then I start talking to them and they say, well, I shame and criticize them when they pick up a screen and I tell them they're not allowed to go outside. So freedom, they need more freedom, and then environment. We need to, and this is kind of what you were talking about in the school setting, create these environments where kids can independently play.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so let's talk about lifestyle. In the beginning, we talked about the mismatch between what childhood looks like for most kids today and what they actually need to thrive from a developmental and evolutionary perspective. So taking into consideration all you've learned about optimal natural child development, how would you design a lifestyle for a child today? What ingredients do you see as essential? Well,
I think, so, when you say something like design a lifestyle for children, the modern mind thinks almost like, okay, what kind of curriculum should the parent provide for the child? What are the activities? And I get those questions quite literally. Sometimes they're from organizations, sometimes they're from schools, sometimes, what's appropriate for a 6-year-old? What's appropriate for, and my response to all of that is our task is not to decide what our children need to do. Mm-hmm. Our task is to provide them with the opportunities to do lots of different things, and especially to do the things that they seem to most want to do. And so our task is to provide opportunities. So what are the opportunities that I think every child should have today? And one way to think about that is if you were to design a school for self-directed education, like the Sudbury Valley School, which has now been in existence for 50 years and has many, many graduates who are doing well in the world, where children are just following their own interests. What should that environment include? What do you want in that environment? So it's the job of the adults not to decide what the children will do in the environment, but what the environment will have in it.
Right.
Where children can now use this environment in the ways that they wish. So the environment should have lots of good outdoor space, ideally. So this is ideal. We're not going to be able to, in not every place but it should have rocks to climb on. It should have trees to climb. It should have mud to play in. It should have flowing water to dabble in and find tadpoles in, and so on and so forth. So in other words, nature. You should have nature that's available for the child to play in. That doesn't mean every child is going to be really attracted to nature. I think most children will to some degree. And I don't think it's a disaster if a child isn't, right? I've known kids who grew up, I grew up in nature. I was outdoors all the time as a kid. I did very little reading. I knew some kids, I couldn't understand them. They were what we would today call nerds. They didn't want to go outdoors, They would rather read. It made no sense to me, but they would rather read. Reading is so isolating. It causes obesity. Probably causes violence too. But that's what they did. And it turned out they grew up okay.
Yeah.
They grew up okay. They had the option of going outdoors. They chose to read, and they became librarians and professors and things like that, and they're doing okay. So we can trust kids, but I think every child should have the option of playing in nature. I think that every child should have access to the range of tools that we use in our culture. These tools, the primary tool, as I keep saying, is the computer, right? You can't live in this culture without recognizing that almost no matter what you're going to do in this world, you're going to have to be able to be good at computers. It's almost the only thing you have to be good at, right? Yeah. We're entering a world where it's probably not going to be so important to know how to drive anymore. It's probably going to be not as important to know how to write well because we have all these speaking mechanisms,
Right.
Okay. I still think everybody's going to learn how to read and write and all these kinds of things. That they're not that difficult to learn. But in terms of no matter what job you have, there's going to be a computer involved in it. So if you make your decision, I'm not going to let my child have a computer, you are depriving your child of the primary tool of our culture today. And one thing we know is the earlier you start using a tool, the more natural that tool is going to be to you as you grow up. The more you're going to be able to use that tool, kind of an extension of your body. It's like hunter-gatherers recognize, they let their toddlers, 2-year-olds, play with knives, sharp knives. They let them play with bows and arrows. They don't let them play with the poison darts. They let them play with fire. They recognize that these things that they do let them play with, you could get hurt with, but you're not going to kill yourself with it. Right. And you get hurt with it, and you're going to recover from it. And they recognize that if they let their little children play with those things, the children, first of all, want to play with those because they can see how important they are to the culture, but also the children will become good at using those things by playing with them, and they will be able to begin using them in useful ways. Earlier on, they will ultimately be better at them, but for starting at early. And I think the same thing is true with computers. I see how easily my son, when he was a young kid, just when we first began to have kind of kits that you could build computers from, I would never have been able to do that. He could do it. He was attracted to it. It was so fascinating to him. And I see today kids at the leading edge, they always figure out the new computer technology before their parents do. Yeah. Partly because mostly because they're more interested in it, I think, but also because they're at an age when their mind has a kind of openness to new experiences and is able to see things that our older minds have to some degree closed ourselves off to. At least many of us have, right? And they're more quickly able to learn some of these things.
It's like a native language.
It's like learning your native language as opposed to learning it later on as a foreign language, right? That's a very good example of that. So clearly the computer, in whatever way you want to use it, not that I'm advocating that children should have access to pornography. Cut that out, right? Right. But in other ways, right? So the computer. Clearly, I think it's important to have books around and reading around, to be in an environment, if the parents don't read, but to be in an environment where other people are reading and they can see that reading is fun. Reading is always going to be, at least for the foreseeable future, a valued skill in our culture. An environment in which people make real use of numbers, because it is, we are a numerate culture. You would be a little bit lost if you didn't have any concept of what numbers are, or what adding is, and dividing and subtracting. And
Yeah, money makes the world go round.
money makes the world go around, and everything we do, we measure and we count and so forth. We probably do a little too much of that, but
Yeah.
that's part of our culture. And if children are isolated from that in one way or another, I'll just give you an example of that. So I have a colleague who is interested in mathematical development, and I'm not that interested. I don't really care about mathematical development beyond a certain point. But he's done some interesting experiments. So one of the things we know, no surprise, is that kids who come from middle-class homes do better at math in school, just as they do better in a lot of other things in school, than kids who come from poor families. So this person has done some research into, well, what's the different experiences that kids have growing up in a middle-class home versus an impoverished home. And he found that one of the differences, interestingly, is that kids growing up in middle-class homes, they have access to games that involve counting and numbers, right?
Right.
Even a game like Candyland, or any game where you're spinning a spinner and it comes out a number, and then you count that number on the board, your man along a path, and then you get a card that says go back 8 spaces. You're learning the concept of number when you're doing that. You're learning it in a very physical and concrete way. Ideally, we're not giving these games to our children so that they will learn that as a lesson, but we're giving it because it's fun for kids to play. And it turns out middle-class families tend to have those games around. Even the parents tend to play games that involve numbers, and the kids get involved in games that involve numbers. And so his research showed that there seemed to be a direct correlation between the degree to which kids were playing those kinds of games and how well they were doing in math classes early on in elementary school. And so I guess I'm presenting this as an example of what should be in the environment. Yeah, there should be in the environment games like that, and including computer games. I mean, I've heard from parents who've talked about one of the things I'm interested in is how kids learn mathematical abilities, and I've heard from unschooling parents one unschooling parent described her child, I don't remember how old the child was, maybe 10 or 11, who's playing this game that somehow involves being able to calculate compound interests, being able to make translations from one currency to another, how much, from one nation's currency to another. And he's doing all this very complex math, all for the sake of the game. And it's way more complex math than he would ever be doing if he were in school, right? So, and it's all very meaningful to him. So to have these kinds of things available, whether it's on computers or whether it's board games, that I think is part of a growing environment. Probably the most important thing we need to provide for children, and this is true in modern times, and it's true any time in history, the most important element in a child's environment, leave aside, obviously I don't want to minimize the importance of parents. Parents have to be there to feed the child. The child don't die without the parents there to feed the child and make sure the child is protected from death, from things that kill the child, right? So I don't want to minimize the role of children of adults, but the role of other children is what we are currently underestimating. Children really need other children in their environment. Ideally, a whole lot of other children over a range of ages throughout human history. They almost always, this was true. I mean, it's true that during the farming era, there were families that were kind of isolated, farm families were kind of isolated. But at least they tended to have fairly large families, and the kids had their siblings to play with, if not neighboring farm kids to play with. But generally speaking, throughout the world, children have always been surrounded, and they enter a culture of childhood, beginning around age 4 and continuing on into the teenage years, where they're spending more time with other children than they are with adults. And they are learning all that stuff we talked about in play. All those important lessons come from interacting with other children away from adults. So that we need to provide for our kids. So these are just some of the things that I'm saying, that it's our job as adults to somehow, and our job as a society, to somehow figure out how to provide these kinds of things to all children, regardless of where they live, regardless of their socioeconomic conditions, so that all children have the opportunity to educate themselves, because all children are motivated to educate themselves. All children are going to make use of the environment in ways that promote their own healthy psychological and physical development if they have access to it.
Yes. Okay, I love all that. I want to live in that world. Okay, let's move into our Q&A. So I posted in the Sage Parenting Tribe on Facebook that we were going to chat about play today and asked if anyone had any questions about it. Leah asks, how can we help children who haven't had the opportunity to freely play in the past relearn and redevelop those play skills again? We do know through research that the ability to play and imagine absolutely can disappear if we don't foster opportunities and environment for it. So once we become aware, how do we help them relearn the joy? And I will add that I get this question a lot from parents who grew up in the mainstream school system. How can they reconnect with the creativity and playfulness that they lost?
Right. You know, that's a good question. And in fact, one of the things I was worried about when the Patchogue Megford school system started this play club, I thought, well, maybe it's not going to work because the kids have grown up not playing, and they're not going to know how to play. They're going to just fight, or they're not going to know how to get a game going. And I was so pleasantly surprised that they were all playing, and they were playing a lot of different ways. They were making up games. They were playing in a wide variety of ways. I think, and I believe that one of the reasons it worked, one of the reasons that was true, is the age mixed aspect of it. The little kids had not forgotten how to play, right? And the little kids were, I believe, inspiring the older kids to really play.
Absolutely.
The older kids would join in with the little kids, and then that would inspire them, and then they would make up their own games. So I think that's one solution to the problem. Little kids innately know how to play, and be sure. So older kids who aren't playing, if they're interacting with little kids, play will come back to them. And the little kids also give older kids an excuse to play in ways that our culture would. So teenagers think they're too sophisticated to play with clay, let's say, or to color, right, or to do those kinds of things. But if they see little kids doing it, that gives them an excuse to do it. They're doing it with the little kids, right?
Yep.
They're helping out the little kids, but they're playing. They're doing it. They're now playing, and I think that by interacting, they remain playful for a longer time, or they regain a playfulness that maybe they never had before by virtue of interacting with younger kids. So that's part of it. The other thing that can happen. So one program that I've observed to some degree is a program called Playworks. This is different from the play workers that I described earlier. So Playworks is a program that developed as an aid to recess in schools, in traditional schools. And it came about because of the observation that kids are going out at recess and not knowing what to do, or just going out in recess, and if they're allowed to be on their iPhone, they just go on their iPhone, or going out to recess and they get into fights, and then they come into school and they're still involved in the fight, and it's hard to get them settled down to lessons, which the school thinks is important for them to get back to their lessons. So Playworks came about in order to help, and I'll use the word scaffold, which I used previously in a different context, to scaffold play. And at first I was sort of against the concept. Why on earth do we need to bring adults into young people how to play? But it began to make some sense if we assume, so these are like fifth graders, sixth graders, or fourth or fifth, sixth graders, and they're going out and not playing. Now, admittedly, part of the problem is, and this was where I observed it, is in the Boston school system, and they only have a 15-minute recess. That's hardly enough
Oh
time
my gosh.
to get anything started. I mean, that's child abuse, in my opinion, to have
Agreed.
15-minute recess for elementary school kids. There are some schools elsewhere that don't have any recess.
And don't forget, if they're wiggling during class, then they get punished by losing that 15 minutes of recess time.
And I've even heard of schools where there's somebody with a bullhorn telling the kids that they're not allowed to be noisy at lunch. They're not allowed to talk in a noisy way.
Yeah. On my kids, when we tried traditional public school, they were not allowed to run on the playground.
Not allowed to run on the playground.
Yeah.
I've heard of places not allowed to play tag because it involves touching, God forbid.
Yep. They weren't allowed to touch each other. Yep.
And one school I know of, they're not allowed to play games in which you're imitating a video game player. You're not allowed. How on earth that rule came about?
Wow.
I don't know. But this is the way recesses typically operate. Okay, somebody was one time mimicking a video game player and maybe hurt somebody or offended somebody, and so now we have a rule against.
So just remove it.
Yeah. So if you take that approach, pretty soon you can't do anything at recess.
Yeah.
Right? You can't. So that's the typical approach at recess. But this is a little better than that. So this is so what they decided to do. This program, it's sort of funded by nonprofit funds, so it doesn't cost the school much to bring it in. And so they have these play facilitators, and these tend to be young adults, kind of in their 20s, very, very fresh, energetic, really likable young people that, in my experience meeting them. They really are. And they are play facilitators. And what they do, so recess starts and they get up a game. It might be some old-fashioned game, dodgeball or pump-up pull-away, or so the games that people used to play that every kid used to know, although it varied from neighborhood to neighborhood what game. But since kids are not growing up in neighborhoods playing the games, they would teach them a game. And then to start off, the young person who's the playworks person would start off playing it with them and then fade out into the background. It might start off by helping remind them of the rules, but then once they've got it, would back off and then just play themselves. So it's a sort of scaffolding. It's like teaching. The good thing about it, nobody was required to play the game, only those who wanted to play the game. But my observations, at least on the couple of sessions I observed, was most of the kids wanted to play the games. They had the option. They could just play on playground equipment if they wanted. They could just sit and talk if they wanted, and some of them chose that. So it wasn't forced, and it seemed to me that the kids were having fun. And one thing I also learned, I have a friend who is a sort of math coordinator for Boston Public Elementary Schools. And so she goes into basically all of the schools over the course of the year, or at least did at that time. And she said in every school that has Playworks, the play worker young guy or girl is the most popular person in school. Somehow this fresh person who likes play and is playful is enjoyed by the kids and by the teachers, and brings a more playful attitude to the whole school environment. I'm not exactly sure the mechanism of how that occurs, but so I can only be positive. I really, everything I've learned about this program seems to be very positive. But that's one way. That way of. I also can give another example. There's a guy named Mike Lanza who wrote a book called Playborhood, in which he describes. I would recommend this to parents. He describes. Lives in Menlo Park, California, which is sort of an upper class. It's people in technology world live there, and so it's a neighborhood where people have a certain amount of wealth, but because housing is terribly expensive, you still have small houses and small yards. And he moved into this neighborhood, and he has now 3 boys. At that time, he had 1. And to him, it was very important that his kids have kids to play with. And there seemed to be no kids out playing. He learned he could see that there were kids there because he could see them standing out waiting for the school bus in the morning
Right.
with their parents. They are protecting them while they wait for the school bus, right? And so he knew there were kids there, but they were never outdoors except when they were standing there with their parents waiting for the school bus. So he decided to do something about it. And what he did was this sort of audacious thing of turning his front yard into a playground.
That's
Not the
awesome.
backyard, not the backyard, but the front yard that everybody could see. And so there was a nice sandbox. There was a place for water play. There was a sort of little basketball. There was a basketball hoop on the driveway. You could do this apparently in California. There was a toy box with toys in it, outdoor toys. There was a opportunity to draw with chalk on a board. And so his kids would play out there, and they also put their family picnic table out there. And so you couldn't help but notice the Lances.
Right.
They were the only ones outdoors. And so people were walking over, curious, or maybe just going out to walk the dog. They were outdoors occasionally, would stop and they'd talk to the Lances. And the Lances would say, your kids are very welcome to play here, and they can even play here when we're not here.
Aww.
And so basically they sort of put up a please trespass sign on their front yard. And all these toys. And then in addition to that, this is where we're getting to the sort of question of for kids who can't play. So some of the older kids, Mike realized, so they would play, but they didn't really seem to know how to play any of the old-fashioned games. They didn't seem to know how to get a game going. So he started, by himself, a summer day camp. There was just a neighborhood day camp right out on the street.
Wow.
And so he taught them, just like I described in this school, he taught them old-fashioned games. And some of the games caught on and some of them didn't. And so, and then he would let them go on and play. So that's a possible solution to the problem that was raised of how do you get, so if kids have grown up really not knowing how to get a game going together, if you've got a bunch of kids, if you teach them some of the old games, and then that stimulates them. Once you know how to play a few games,
right,
traditional outdoor games, you can begin to make up your own. It's not hard to make variations of games depending on what you enjoy doing and who the players are and so on.
It's like opportunity through the environment and then some scaffolding with mixed ages.
Right.
Yeah. All right, let's take our deep dive. The show notes can be found at sageparenting.com/podcast27, where you can also subscribe and get future show notes sent right to your inbox. What are your favorite resources for people to dive deeper into this topic? And of course, the Free to Learn book is going to be at the top of the list. It's one of my top 5 book recommendations for parents out there. And your Freedom to Learn Psychology Today blog, where I often go to look for citations for things.
Good.
So what else do you recommend for people? And you're a part of the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, right? You're the founding...
That's right. So there are 2 foundations that I'm involved with, the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, and this is really a foundation that's aimed at, our vision is that self-directed education, as opposed to coercive schooling, would be available to everybody, that everybody would have the opportunity for that. Right now, it would be difficult for many families that would like to move in that direction. It would be difficult to do it, and we're trying to work towards making that more available. We're trying to publicize it more. We're trying to show to parents how it works, trying to show that it's not the scary thing you might think it's scary. You're not really taking a big risk by allowing your children the freedom to educate themselves, by providing the environment for it to occur, but not by trying to control it through reward and punishment or other coercive means. So that's the Alliance, and then I'm also involved with the Let Grow Foundation, along with Lenore Skenazy and a couple of other people, And this is the group that's really working with communities and with traditional schools to bring more opportunities for play in those environments. So going to the websites of either of those would be, you would find a lot of information and ideas. In terms of books, besides my own, I already mentioned Mike Lanz's book, Playborhood. I would recommend that. He describes not only what he did in his neighborhood, but he gives 7 other examples. I think he has a chapter for each for different neighborhoods, including some very different neighborhoods, including a projects in the Bronx, a project in the Bronx where very low income people are living, how they solve the problem, various ways of solving the problem that takes initiative on the part of somebody to get
Right.
together to make a space available. So that can be for the parents who are looking for what can I do in my neighborhood to get kids outdoors playing, so my kid have somebody to play with. That would be a great book to look at. He's also got a regular website that's been long-standing. So that's another book I would recommend. Just for inspiration, I would recommend reading Lenore Skenazy's book Free Range Kids. It's kind of a classic at this point. For parents who are nervous who believe that the world is more scary than it used to be, and therefore they can't give their own children the freedom that they had as children. Sadly, many parents today, young parents today, didn't have a lot of freedom themselves.
Yeah.
You almost have to go sometimes to the grandparents.
Yeah, myself included.
Yourself included.
Yeah.
So but that's a great book. Lenore is very funny. She's really a stand-up comedian, but and also very funny in her writing, but has a very witty way of getting a point across such that you really understand that point. And so I would recommend that. Those are starters. And there are quite a number of other books on play, but I would sort of the trio that I generally recommend is, of course, my own book, right, and Lenore's book and Mike Lanz's book. I think that by reading that trio, you get a pretty good foundation in why we should be allowing our children to play and how we might go about doing it.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing this conversation with me today. You're making my dreams come true here.
Okay, well, thank you. We've been on for a long time. I don't know if anybody's going to have the patience to listen to it all.
They will. We were playful in our conversation.
Okay, I felt so. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter.